So welcome to our September 2020 Canvas meeting. My name is Brett Nachman. I am glad to see all of you here. All of us at College Autism Network welcome your participation and engagement. This is our monthly Canvas series of presentations. We bring on guest speakers who represent a wide variety of researchers, practitioners, self-advocates, community members around the world who are engaged in autism and post-secondary education work. A few housekeeping items before we get started. I mentioned already, if you can please mute your microphones to eliminate background noise. Otherwise, we'll do that on our end. Also, as I said, you can use your video feed. Feel free to use the chat function, which you should see on the right-hand panel of your screen. And that basically enables folks to share resources and comments, ask questions. There will be many opportunities for asking questions during the presentation today. Many of you probably have the link to our meeting agenda, which kind of captures a snapshot of what we'll be covering today, and I'll be putting that in the chat right now in case you do not have access to that. Our meetings generally last about an hour. We'll start off with a few a few updates. We did housekeeping items, and then we'll turn it over to our colleagues to share their work. Our featured presenter today is Dr. Jonathan Vincent. We'll be talking a lot about autism and employment work. He's quite the established and accomplished scholar as it pertains to autism and post-secondary education work, especially in the United Kingdom. So we're really glad to have him on board for today. And so we'll go ahead and get started. And I also want to add too that, again, with the chat box, that's a great place for putting questions, but also resources. We'll have a moment in a few minutes where we'll encourage everyone who'd like to share examples of articles or resources that you've checked out. We really try to provide opportunities for engagement and dialogue. If you want to speak up, pose a question or a resource, feel free to do so. So we don't want this to just come off as passive, but if you are wanting just to listen, that's quite all right too. So to start off with, as you all probably know and are already connected with, we have our Canvas listserv, which is our mechanism for sharing updates of upcoming Canvas meetings. We know that there have been some research studies and articles that have been disseminated there in the past few weeks, as there always are. So we encourage you to check those out. We have our college autism programs list, which some of you are probably familiar with, which is on our College Autism Network website, and that we recurringly update to reflect the influx of new programs that emerge here in the United States, at the very least. And perhaps one of our hallmarks at College Autism Network is our College Autism Summit. Used to be called the College Inclusion Summit. Now we put autism in the title, and I'm going to turn it over to our master of ceremonies of sorts with the College Autism Summit. That's my colleague Lee Williams, who has some exciting updates to share, I'm sure, on this front, as the event is only, what, about 6 weeks away now, Lee? We're getting close.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Yeah, 6 weeks, which makes me break out in a cold sweat in the middle of the night. Our first big virtual event. The summit will be happening October 27th to 30th. It's going to be great. I think it'll be fun. It'll be educational. We've got about 50 breakout sessions, and a number of you looking at the screen, a number of you are presenters, so it's great to see you, and I hope you're as excited as I am. One of the hallmarks of the summit, one of the earliest kind of visions that we had for it was for it to be an opportunity for researchers and practitioners to engage in meaningful conversation and really have the opportunity to influence one another's work. And I'm really pleased to see that among the 50 breakout sessions we've got, there are a number that are research-oriented and a number that are practice-oriented, and I'm really hoping that there's going to be a great exchange of ideas among folks who are going to be attending. So if you haven't already registered, October 1st is when the rates change. So if you register right now, you get the extremely reasonable early bird rate. After October 1st, it goes up a bit. So please take a look at the website as it's linked in the agenda. And of course, as always, feel free to email me if you have any questions or concerns about the summit. I'm really happy to connect with you. Thanks, Brett.
All right, thank you, Lee. I am putting the link in our chat box. So just in case folks cannot easily access it. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of great programming in store for that. All right, so next, I'd like to turn it over to our working group, which is really a great team of researchers who really encompass a wide variety of backgrounds and experiences all around the world. They have, as led by Kristen and TC and colleagues, it's been a really monumental effort as far as a faculty and teaching training as it pertains to autism and universal design. So I'm going to turn it over to them to share the launch of this exciting effort.
Well, I think I'm taking the honor today of introducing myself first, and then for all of you who don't know me yet or haven't seen me yet, I haven't seen all of you yet. So my name is Shiva Priya Santanam. I go by Shiva. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Speech Language Hearing Sciences at Metropolitan State University of Denver. I'm a speech language pathologist by training, and I run a clinical program to support autistic college students, and then I also conduct research in the same area, along with my other area of research with families from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds. I've been very fortunate to be part of this dynamic and exciting group to create our Autism and Universal Design training. We're excited to announce that we have now launched the training. And we are actively collecting data. The training has multiple parts. So the first part is a pre-training questionnaire that participants complete. And then there are 2 training modules. The first training module is getting folks familiarized with autism. The second training module focuses on universal design principles for teaching. And then once folks complete the training, there is a post-training questionnaire as well that we ask that folks complete once the training is completed. So right now we are planning on recruiting 90 participants, and our participants are primarily teaching faculty, teaching staff at universities, of higher education. And so we're recruiting participants across multiple continents, really. So Canada, the United States, UK, and Australia primarily right now, at least. And so I've posted the link if you have any questions. In our notes here, it says, please contact autismhigheredtraining@gmail.com. If you have any questions, we'd love if you can post this information around to your colleagues or friends that you may know, so we can recruit more participants. And if I'm missing something, TC or Kristen, please feel free to jump in.
That was perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Shiva. Are there any questions that folks have for the team leading this effort in case you'd like to participate? Okay, well, I will assume not at this time, but if you have any questions that emerge, the email is on the meeting agenda. And I know that the website is listed in the chat box as well. Thank you, Shiva and TC and Krista and all of you who have collaborated on that. It's been quite the remarkable journey to see unfold, and we're really excited to see this kick into high gear now. So wonderful. Well, at this point, I want to allocate a little bit of space for folks to share articles or resources. We've been trying to do this over recent meetings to try to make this more of a dialogue. We know that often when Q&A comes into the equation with our presenters, that there are often articles that folks naturally share. So we just want to have a good consolidated space toward that end. And if you want to continue to post in the chat box, that is quite all right too. What we do on our end is we compile all of this and put this in the meeting minutes for you to access at a later point, because the last thing I think any of us want is 20 different windows open at the same time as we are listening to a presentation. So I'll get us started, but I really encourage you to join in. An article that I came across recently comes out of NBC News, and it's from an autistic self-advocate, kind of navigating college and coming into his own in terms of different aspects of his identity as it pertains to not only disability or autism, but also as a member of the LGBTQ community. He identifies as Black as well. There's a lot of intersectional identities that surfaced as he described his experiences. And it's just a really powerful piece. So I'd encourage you to check that out if you'd like. I'm going to turn it over to others if they want to talk about articles at this point. You can either formally put it in the agenda or in the chat box as well. So feel free to speak up if you'd like.
Okay, in a totally self-serving, hi, this is Brad, by the way, sorry I'm late. In a totally self-serving manner, I'm gonna drop a DOI into the chat. Oh, sorry, Eric, I jumped in front of you there. Short version is that the piece I just put the link to is a piece long in the making, and essentially lays out a model through which students first recognize and then reframe and then eventually resolve problems that they run into in college. And one of the things that was most striking is that throughout the review process, we kept trying to frame it in a more positive way instead of using words like problem and challenge. But that was how the students thought of it. So we went back in and did a real intense count of words, and it turned out that the students mentioned things like problems or challenge or difficulty at a rate 3 or 4 times as much as the interviewer, and that the interviewer was the inverse, you know, success, achievement, whatever, about 3 times as much as the students themselves. So I just want to point that out because I think the model has some value about the challenges that happen when the student and the institution intersect. Neither fault, both are fault, either way, at the intersections where the problem occurs. But it also is indicative of a real intense kind of internalized self-critique or internalized ableism that was kind of pervasive for these students.
Thank you, Brad. Other articles folks would like to share at this time, feel free to go ahead.
Hi, I have something to share. My name is Maggie. I haven't been on in a long time, but I appreciate this group. This is more of a pop culture article, but I recently read an article from an autistic analyzing Abed, the character in the show Community, and it was really great to just see them analyze the representation of autism in television. So I'll just add the link here for you all.
All right, thank you, Maggie. Sorry, I couldn't see what I'm doing on my end is I'm pinning the video for whoever's speaking, and sometimes I'm not quick enough to do that so that you're spotlighted. Thank you for sharing that article, Maggie. and we'll put that in the minutes as well. Okay, and I have to note that was very kind of Eric. There was a little press release on the article that Brad Cox served as lead author for with the Review of Higher Education. So there's been a few pieces recently released in some of the higher education journals about some of this work. So Eric, thanks for sharing that. That's very kind. All right. Feel free, as the meeting persists, if other resources come to mind, feel free to drop those in and we'll incorporate those into the meeting agenda. All right, well, this is the point where we're going to turn it over to our featured presenter, Dr. Jonathan Vincent, at, excuse me, at York St. John University. He's a senior lecturer there. He's, as I mentioned at the top of the meeting, he's produced a lot of work on autism post-secondary education. I know he's connected with some of the folks in our Canvas community as well in different efforts, and has definitely played a big role in what we're understanding about autistic college students' experiences, really focused on their perspectives. So Jonathan will be sharing his presentation. At this point, there will be time for Q&A. Feel free to insert those questions in the chat as he's presenting, and we'll allocate at least the last 15 minutes of the meeting toward that end. So Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Okay, shall I just share my screen here?
Yes, please go right ahead.
Yeah, okay. Okay, can people see that? Yeah. Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to be a part of the day today. And I should begin by apologizing for not being as active as I should have been. I've got 2 small children under 3, so normally the meetings just fall right when I'm doing bedtime and dinner and things. So, but it's a real privilege to be part of it today with you. And as Brett said, so I'm based in York in the UK. It's in the north of England, but I'm actually Northern Irish, so my accent's a bit different. And what I want to do is just talk through some of the research that I've been doing around transitions from higher education. I'm focusing specifically on the transitions out of higher education and into employment, focused on qualitative studies that I've done over the last couple of years. I should say that the work is part of kind of what I'm doing, but is also part of a training group called Pro Autism. So the logo is just at the top right of the screen there. And that really is, I suppose, some of the practice that we're trying to do in terms of developing understanding and capacity among employers, and that's a training group made up of autistic and non-autistic people, and that sort of came out of this research and also feeds back into it in some ways. So it's a privilege to be able to share that with you, and I'm doing that, I suppose, on behalf of myself and those individuals in Pro Autism. So it's a couple of different studies that I want to talk about, and the first focuses specifically on the transition out of higher education for autistic students and graduates, and the second then focuses on the transition into employment. So I'm going to try and do a bit of a whistle-stop tour through both of these, but and I hope we've got time at the end to discuss them. The first was published in Autism in 2019, and the second then in the Scandinavian Journal of Disability Research. Interesting, you mentioned the publication that Brad and Brett and others did around higher education journals, because the second one actually was rejected, desk rejected from higher education journal on the basis that it didn't have it wasn't significant enough for higher education. So we went elsewhere with it, but these both, I guess, kind of fit together, and I'll try and pull them together a little bit at the end. But I really want to sort of go through and scope out, I guess, some of the key things that came out of the students and graduates' accounts of their experiences of these 2 different forms of transition. I know that Ailey and Jack looked at this last time and did a good job of kind of scoping out the current autistic population in the UK, but I just wanted to cover this as well in case it was new to people. Certainly in the United Kingdom, and this is definitely represented elsewhere as well, the rates of disclosure of autistic students is going up, and I'm sure people are very familiar with that. In the UK, we have the Higher Education Statistical Agency, HESA, which collect that. And you can see actually that the numbers look for 2018-19 around about 13,000, but I've included the box below as well, which has about 34,000, and that's students who have 2 or more conditions. So around 13,000 disclose, and then we've got a whole bunch of other people who probably have co-occurring conditions, but tick this box and then we don't really know anything more about them. We've also, I suppose, got students who don't disclose at all, a whole bunch of women and girls who perhaps haven't gone through the diagnostic process yet, and those who choose not to disclose. So in the UK, certainly it looks on paper at about 13,000, but we know it's probably significantly higher than that. And that's also replicated, I guess, in the States, where this study by Jackson, Hart and Volkmar suggests that there's probably about 250,000 autistic children who will transition into college in the next decade or so. So I think this is, brilliant to see that there are significantly more autistic people coming into university. But I guess with that, there's also issues around what happens next. And that was really the area that I was really interested in. People within this group and elsewhere have been doing fantastic work in terms of induction and the support for students as they're in college and university. But I was really struck by the what happens next element of it. And in the United Kingdom, we've got an organisation called AGCAS, the Association for Graduate Careers Advisory Services. And every year they do a survey of our graduates and what happens next. We collect those data centrally, but they produce a report looking at disabled students particularly, and to find out kind of what happens next. They follow them up after 6 months and then 2 years. And I've put the box here in terms of social and autism. And 2 things just to note. Firstly, that this sort of violet box at the top shows that they have the highest rate of unemployment out of any disabled group, but as well, by comparison to those with no known disability, significantly higher, and also the highest rate of, or the lowest rate rather, of full-time work. So to me, this really indicated that there's a significant problem in terms of what happens next for these individuals. And that really resonates strongly, I suppose, with what we know more broadly around the autistic population and work, that in the UK, only around 16% of those with an autism diagnosis are in full-time employment. So, but I suppose the difference is this group are highly qualified, have developed lots of skills and qualities to make them successful, but there's still a significant gap. And so I was really interested in what was going on and why that was happening. So there were 2 studies which sort of form, I suppose, 2 phases of data collection. The first phase was a set of semi-structured interviews with 21 autistic students and graduates. And that's pretty evenly matched in terms of students, graduates, more male than female who participated, and about 8 university settings. And then the second phase was a follow-up really to that, and was among different community stakeholders. So it really developed out of the interviews insofar as thinking around, it's not just an individual who gets a job, but there's a whole range of other players who really participate in that. So I wanted to speak to them, and our training group Pro Autism facilitated the focus groups for this. So you can see you've got a mix of academic staff, employers, different careers, counsellors, etc., involved in those focus groups. And we analysed those data then thematically and to try and sort of pull out some of the key themes. The first paper focused just on the first phase, looking at transitions, and the second pulled together both phases. So I want to kind of take a bit of a run through the main findings really from these two studies, and identify, I guess, some of the key themes, but also give some space to listen to the accounts of some of these autistic students and graduates, because for me that's really the most interesting and important part. The four kind of key themes, I guess, for the first study, which was published in Autism, I've put a kind of seesaw, which is meant to represent the kind of up and down mixed aspect of it, but and that's kind of what we see here. For some, there was a sense of transition as causing and amplifying anxiety. It was around loss, but then on the other end, there was transition as a positive departure and the potential for new identities to develop. And I want to run through just some of those, the data that came out from those different themes, if you will. But I suppose in this sense, there's a kind of a mix, some of which is quite hopeful, I think. So just to give us a sense then of some of the things that the students and graduates talked about, I think probably one of the key things was to do with the unknown nature, and Izzy kind of talks about this, and this is the title of the paper, it's the fear of the unknown. The sense that on leaving higher education, they were kind of dropping off the grid. They didn't know what was going to be next. They didn't know if they were going to be getting a job. They didn't know if they were going to be living at home. They didn't know if they're going to be moving to a different city or a different country. And so all of those unknowns really made what is a difficult experience for, I guess, many graduates leaving university, but for this group was particularly amplified, and led to very increased levels of anxiety. This was the most coded item in my data for this. And one of the results, and I think probably coping mechanisms, was the avoidance of then doing anything about it, that it was too big to think about, and so it went unacknowledged. They kind of pushed it away until they absolutely had to deal with it. But that had implications, as we'll see, in terms of then employment opportunities, because they weren't perhaps engaging in processes in the context where the support was based very often. And I think that was a coping mechanism for many of them, particularly. That said, transition was also potentially positive, and Eliza kind of talks about the idea of she likened it to running a marathon, that getting toward the end of the degree and her program, she could see the end, she could see the finish line, and she was excited about getting to the end. She spent a long time of her life, her teenage years, gearing up to this, and she was finally sort of getting to the finish point. So it wasn't all negative by any means. It wasn't to say she didn't feel anxious, but she felt excited. Similarly, Lewis kind of talks about the idea of being ready. He developed and garnered the skills, the qualities that were going to kind of make him successful, he felt, and he was ready for it. So I think there's a kind of balance in terms of high levels of anxiety sometimes, but also a kind of a mix of excitement around what might be next. A significant theme, I think, as well, was around loss. And actually loss was to do with loss of independence, loss of relationships and friendships, loss of momentum, and also loss of identity. Like I said with Eliza, so much of her teenage years had been sort of gearing up to this, and an awful lot of time and effort had been put into developing the skills and the routines to be successful, and feeling proud of where they'd got to with that. And then getting to the end of it, this transition was about losing all of that, losing everything that had been worked hard to gain, and going home. And I think the loss of independence was a big part of it, particularly. Having to move home was really difficult. Ezra talks about the idea of feeling homesick for university, it's usually the other way around. So in this case, they felt like they were having to lose an awful lot when they made that transition. But again, the kind of on balance, then there were also potential gains in terms of the potential to develop different identities, and those identities might be around becoming part of the workforce, which was again a highly coded item, developing an identity as an adult, and also then developing the identity in terms of self-concept and how they felt about themselves, which is, I think, what we see here with Lily, feeling more confident, feeling like she has the capacity to deal with things, that life hadn't gotten easier necessarily, but she felt more able to deal with it. And again here, the identity of being part of the workforce. John says, I know I'd feel the next level of fulfillment if I had a job, if I get paid and I'm enjoying it. Knowing that I've been able to get a job would be sort of another level almost on the checklist of life for me. So this sense of being part of this, developing this new identity as an adult, being independent, I think offered something which anybody moving into that stage of life probably feels and was really important to this sample, particularly of students and graduates. So these 4 themes, and I'm kind of rushing my way through them, but I think they were balanced, and they showed that there was a mixture of both things that were difficult, but equally things that were hopeful and were positive. And so I suppose to summarize the transition out of higher education, it's not all bad, but there's the potential for it to be challenging, and there's also the potential for there to be sort of new developments and new routes being explored in terms of what happens next. In terms of the transition to employment, I've sort of visualized that slightly more negatively in terms of a brick wall and a no entry sign. And unfortunately, that really was, I guess, how it went. There was a desire to be part of the workforce, like John said, but there was a real barrier in terms of accessing that. And the kind of themes that were identified were around a lack of mobility. That's not just a physical mobility, but being mobile in kind of human geography sense of being able to move about and do what you want to do and develop a sense of identity and belonging almost. And also then the other factors that serve to either afford opportunities or create barriers to those around recruitment processes, the embodied experience, and then also the resources which might help individuals access different forms of employment. And again, I just want to give you a flavour of some of the things that some of these students and graduates talked about here. One of the key things I think that came out across both of these studies was this idea of falling under the radar. This has to do with the sense of students who were considered by university personnel, but also by employers as being high functioning, and perhaps even identified themselves in that way. But for that reason, they often didn't get access to the support that they might have felt would have been useful. They were perceived as being too high functioning. They had a degree, perhaps they had a master's, maybe even a PhD. They were qualified. They clearly could do this. They could do well at university. So they were perceived as not needing any support. But the reality was they weren't able to access employment. So they kind of fell under this radar. And like this individual says, they end up going through the unemployed, employed cycle forever, because they weren't able to get the support in place because they were too high functioning, but they weren't able to access the jobs for a variety of different reasons. And that really had implications in terms of their success. I think Kieran's probably a bit exceptional, but he applied for 2,000 jobs before he got his current one. And I suppose if you think about just that in terms of the persistent rejection and what that would mean in terms of one's mental health and well-being and self-concept, there's such a level of persistence to keep going. So their experience was pretty negative, and that was one of the big reasons why I actually, along with an autistic graduate, set up this group Pro Autism, because I wanted to address that and think about how we could do things differently. A key aspect, I think, was to do with getting into employment, and there were barriers in relation to the processes involved in that. And those processes were job adverts, job specifications, interview processes, and then sort of onboarding processes, as well as being in work. And this graduate kind of talks about the idea of the job specification, just starting in the middle. One section in there is specific for the job, and everything else is just standard. I think normally you'd understand you don't have to meet all the criteria 100%, but if you're autistic and you read really, really carefully, you can probably exclude yourself from all the jobs because you just can't meet everything 100%. And so it's not just the job adverts themselves. And I did do some training with the Ministry of Justice here, who run our prisons and police services and everything else. And I asked them to look at some of their job adverts and think about how accessible they were. And they were sort of, once they took a step back, realized that probably lots of the language they used was quite inaccessible, quite obscure, didn't really have much to do with the job itself. So the job specifications and job adverts can be a barrier, but then also navigating and interpreting those can be difficult. And it might take some additional support and help to do that. But if this group goes under the radar and doesn't get that support, then they're less likely to be able to navigate these systems. There were also other issues around job interviews and things like that. But I've got another paper which is currently under review, which is looking a bit more at those processes. But a big part was certainly around accessing these processes. In order to gain the support to navigate these systems, often disclosure was a part of that. But in this case, this group didn't always perceive themselves as being disabled, and so therefore the kind of ticking the yes/no box of disability was more complicated. This person says, I don't see myself as disabled because I've got Asperger's. So they saw their diagnosis as being a positive. It wasn't a disability. And so therefore, when this box on the application form is there, they don't tick it, and they therefore don't get access to the accommodations and reasonable adjustments and support that might be there. And that then feeds back into this process of employment-unemployment cycle. Another aspect was to do with the process of disclosure. So here it says it's difficult to know when it's appropriate to bring it up in the interview. How do you bring it up? Do you do it lightheartedly? Do you do it kind of jokingly? Do you do it seriously? When should you do it? It's nothing specific. I wish there was a little handbook. And she, I think, makes a really important point about this is a difficult question answer about when and how and to whom and in what way, and who can that be shared with, etc. These are questions which I think anybody would struggle to answer, and there isn't an answer really, because it might be dependent on the job, on the company, on the situation itself. But it's certainly an additional concern that autistic graduates are having to decide, and an additional form of labour almost that others might not have to think through. So the embodied experience of autism, I think, is important and is sometimes underplayed. But in this, I think there's two ways of seeing it, probably more than two, but certainly these data suggested that there's some really positive aspects, and we know that there are a range of traits, autistic traits, which are advantageous in employment settings. What Grace talked about was being very organized, being very conscientious about getting things done. With excessive worrying, they often get things done. I'm always thinking about work. I'm always thinking, I've got to do this tomorrow. I'm thinking about what needs to be done because I'm generally a perfectionist. It means that it has to be great. It has to be on point. So for her attention to detail, her mindset in terms of getting it done and making it just right was, I think, an example of the type of trait that makes autistic graduates some of the best potential employees that companies will never employ. That said, there is also an embodied experience which makes it much more challenging in internships, in working environments, in interview settings. The reason it's draining is because you're so busy focusing on your body language, your behavior, trying not to say anything inappropriate, creating that coverage to pass as normal. So that the the draining experience of simply having to camouflage and mask during an interview is taking away from focusing on other aspects, focusing on the answer to the question or whatever it might be. And that creates a different barrier, which is one that neurotypical people are not having to think through. And not only is that, you know, emotional, physical experience draining, but it also, I suppose, can lead to the kind of sensory overload or even meltdown experience that Eliza talks about here. She was working in a shop and she was sort of partially conscious of what's happening, because at that point I was like, I'm going to have a meltdown. It's going to be on the shop floor. I just literally walked past my colleague and said, I'm having a meltdown. I'll be out the back, tell the manager. She was fortunate to live or to work in a place where her manager was supportive, but again, that sort of experience is one that is an additional concern and challenge for autistic graduates as they move into employment. So this last bit is just around the resourcing aspect, and the participants really talked about how important it was to have the right type of support, and I think this is why Canvas is such an important resource internationally for looking at this, for helping university staff and personnel understand, if you have Asperger's, you're not like everyone else. You can't just go up and get a job. You have to have a lot of help. And that might be different for different people, but certainly understanding that support needs to be tailored to the needs of individuals, or perhaps having particular programs, in this case, the second one about the employment course at the university, for building a CV. I did speak to careers and they gave me a mentor, someone who worked for the UN. So having the right type of support at the right time, delivered by the right people, and ideally making that type of training participatory and have autistic people involved in it, I think is probably one of the real strengths that we could, as a group, be involved in. So I just want to pull out just a handful of kind of implications, I guess. First of all, these two studies were separate, but they are connected insofar as a difficult transition out of higher education has implications, I think, for accessing employment, and particularly where the anxiety levels are so high that the process of looking for employment and accessing the right support is avoided, then I think that increases the likelihood of not getting into graduate level employment, and that seems to be kind of borne out in the data that we have. I think there's real implications in terms of not getting access to employment has kind of run-on effects for other things, particularly mental health. Like I mentioned with Kieran, the idea of being persistently rejected from jobs certainly would have an impact on my mental health. So mental health and well-being, but also the financial stability that comes with a job, and giving the potential to live independently and move away from your family if that's what you want to do, etc. So it has other negative implications, and can limit mobilities in other ways. Good to know that staff in universities and colleges can play a really positive role, and I think, again, Canvas is playing a really significant role in developing some of the programs and supports that will make a difference, and it's good to know that we do that. But I think we're in a position now where we really need to know more about these transitions from higher education and into employment. There's such a dearth of research that's good, mixed, longitudinal studies, because I think it's only when we understand these phenomena, what's happening here, that we can really begin to put in place the right kind of provisions. So I'm excited to know how we can look at that together in the future. But for me, that's kind of the big area that I think we need to be working on as we move forward. So I just wanted to mention and put here, in terms of the right kind of provision, I think training is part of it, training employers. Our group Pro Autism put together a series of videos which people are welcome to use. They're on YouTube, put the link there. As I said, made up of autistic and non-autistic people, talking about things that make a difference, things that are challenging. So if you want to do some training with employers or staff or whoever, those are there for you if they'd be useful. And that just leaves me to say thank you for listening, and to all of my participants and my team at Autism as well. It's been a real privilege to be part of it today. So thank you very much. I'll hand it over to questions. Shall I stop sharing, Brett?
If you want to leave it on the screen, you're welcome to. Otherwise,
okay.
Fantastic, Jonathan. Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and I realize that there are several, so we'll try to get to the ones in the chat box first, and then if there are others that emerge. So to be mindful of time, I'd encourage to be succinct, but these are great questions. And Jonathan, the first question comes from Maggie, who asks, do you find that most participants had both positive and negative feelings about graduating, or was the group as a whole more split between those positive and negative emotions?
I would say it probably was, on balance, it was probably more negative. Not about graduating. I think they felt positive about graduating and getting to that point. Although Ailey and Jack's study last week showed that that's not always a given. But for those who were able to, I think they felt positive about getting to that point. I think it was just on balance, the anxiety about what was going to happen next. So if we want to go on basis of frequency of codes, there were definitely more items that suggested they were more anxious than they were excited about that.
All right, thank you. Cheryl's question is, what kinds of vocational support services do UK universities typically provide? So for example, CV writing, recruitment for jobs through the university, etc.
So I think this is an area that is really just developing at the minute, and is a bit variable. There are a range of different employment courses which are run by universities, and somewhere like University of Bath, I think, probably has one of the best programs and most developed programs, and that's working in partnership with, can't think, Morgan Stanley possibly, or one of the big banks, and has a partnership with them. They run a program during Easter, which is probably the most established, I would say, in the UK. Other universities are doing bits and pieces, probably a bit more ad hoc, working with their career services, but there's nothing as nearly as established as there is in terms of induction programs. So yeah, CV writing workshops. I've been involved in mock interviews, but it's a bit sort of piecemeal at the minute.
Gotcha, thank you. Shiva's question, first she said very insightful presentation. Was it easier to find jobs in some professions, or were there other factors you thought that helped some folks find jobs more easily than others? It reminds me of the book by Janine Booth, an autistic author who wrote on workplace equality and experiences.
I have the book behind me. Yes, it was a mix actually, that probably to do with the fact of just my sample wasn't necessarily super representative, but there was a mix. It wasn't certainly the case that everybody wanted to go into working in STEM, and in fact quite a lot of people were, their bachelor's degrees were in the arts and humanities as well, so they were interested in creative writing, were interested in teaching. It was a mix. It certainly wasn't the case that they were all going in to become computer analysts, but I wouldn't say that that is necessarily the case across the whole of the autistic population, because we really don't know, and that would be something I think we need to find out, is what are the autistic students studying and what do they want to do, and are they being able to achieve those things and go into those professions, because at the minute we don't have a clue. But yeah, it's a good question.
Next question, there's many favorable comments in the chat. The next specific question comes from Ailey, one of our co-presenters from last month, who says, very interested to see camouflaging come up. What do you think employers could or should do to help autistic people to not camouflage?
It's a good question. I think that it's not possible probably for employers to do anything unless they know that someone is autistic. And I guess all the training that we do, and certainly the autistic people who are part of the training that we do, say what we need to do is to create environments in workplaces where people feel able to share and be open and say, I'm autistic, and that not to be a big deal, and for people to be able to say, oh, okay, what does that mean? How can I help you? And I think once we create that sort of culture where being different is fine and having different needs is okay, then it opens up the space for conversations about how they can help, and it also then diffuses the need to camouflage. So it's not until, I guess, we probably change the culture of workplaces to some extent, and we increase managers, hiring managers, but also colleagues' levels of knowledge and understanding about autism, that we'll be able to see that. I don't really know. I'd be interested to know what Ailey thinks. But I think it's not until we really can change the culture of places, which will be probably a long time, sadly. But once there's a higher level of knowledge and understanding, then people will not feel the need to camouflage. I guess that's the same for like LGBTQ, community. Felt a long time the need to camouflage and pass, etc. And it's only in recent years that's changed. So yeah, and in some respects it hasn't changed as well. So I think it'll be the same for the autistic community. Once people become a bit more open-minded about difference, then we'll begin to see changes there.
Absolutely. Next question that I'm seeing is from Kristen. Thanks for an excellent talk. What factors do you think longitudinal research in this area should investigate? I was wondering the same thing. Great question, Kristen.
Well, that's a good question. I should have thought about that. I guess you'd like to know, I mean, I'd be interested to know in both, whether students and graduates are achieving what they want to achieve. Are they going into the types of careers and professions that they perhaps set out to do as part of their degree? If it was a specific degree in engineering, do they become an engineer? Or if they were able to identify a particular field they wanted to work in, journalism, are they able to access that? I mean, I don't know, I suppose that's quite hard. It'd be interesting to know about their mental health and well-being, how that changes over time, how their kind of their own self-concept changes, I guess, in terms of being professional or not. I don't know. I leave these types of questions to my psychology colleagues. But I think it certainly has to be done over time to really see what is happening for this group, because little snapshots, like for any graduate, isn't really that helpful. Even the what happens next data tends to be collected after 6 months, but I wasn't in a graduate job after 6 months, so it's sort of irrelevant. I think it needs to be over a longer period of time to see if people are really achieving what they're capable of doing. Particularly where there are trends around kind of malemployment and people being in jobs which are well below their levels of qualification.
It seems like we have probably time for one more question, and I think it might be the last question in the chat currently, from TC. Did participants talk about safety when disclosing their diagnoses to potential employees? For example, did they feel they quote unquote lost the job as a result of disclosing?
Yeah, I mean, disclosure is a massive issue. And in another paper which we've got on the go it's a big part of it. And people definitely felt like they couldn't disclose, and that when they did disclose, they were actively discriminated against. So disclosure was a massive issue, and they didn't feel confident to do that. I guess the issue is when we talk about it is it will depend on the employer, it'll depend on the company, and even when we're doing training, we try and say to the companies, put this on your website, put this on your LinkedIn profile, put this on your email, whatever, so that people know we've done this training. We're going to be the type of employer that if you disclose to us, we'll take that in a positive way, and that's where people feel more safe and more able to disclose, where a company has demonstrated that they are open to difference and open to kind of neurodivergence in that way. But yeah, it's a huge issue, and I think that's a really good point, TC. Thank you.
I'll also add, as far as a couple of comments in the chat, in case folks have not had a chance to look at that yet. Stephen provided a link to the YouTube channel, the Pro Autism channel. Thank you, Stephen. Ailey provided a link to a recent piece that they published on camouflaging identity and disclosure. All this will be in the meeting minutes. So don't worry about if you can't get all of that right now. And then there's some other comments that provide further validation of what you shared, Jonathan. So thank you again for your time and your scholarship. And I know so many of you all on the call are contributing to filling these gaps. So yes, Beth, yes, Jonathan's articles we can include in the meeting minutes, so folks have access to that. So at this point, it's a few minutes before the hour, so I want to be mindful of everybody's time. So thank you all again for joining us for our Canvas meeting. A few notes before we head off. One is, as Lee said at the top of the meeting, be sure to register for the College Autism Summit before October 1st for that early bird registration rate. We really would love to see as many of you as possible to participate in that. We'll have another Canvas meeting prior to the summit, and that is our October 15th Canvas meeting. We're welcoming on Dr. Julie Lowndes-Taylor at Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt was the host site of our last College Inclusion Summit. So Julie's actually an editor of the Autism Journal. So we know many folks in our Canvas community have published there or wanted to publish there. And so she's going to be, quote unquote, pulling back the curtain tips from the editorial desk. So this might be a good opportunity to learn about the behind the scenes aspects of publishing with the Autism Journal. And then on November 12th, Cheryl Whitman, Dr. Cheryl Whitman recently became a doctor. She's going to be sharing with everybody understanding parent participation in the post-secondary education of students with autism spectrum disorder. So we have a lot of exciting things on the horizon for everyone. Please stay connected with all of us on the Canvas listserv. We'll be releasing the meeting minutes, the articles and other materials, and a link to this video later next week. So I'm wishing all of you good health and happiness for the fall ahead, and we'll see you back here in October. Take good care.
Thanks, Brett.